Jen Hoshina, who is here for confirmation as Undersecretary of the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Ms. Hoshina, you have to stop meeting like this. Seems like this is sort of an annual ritual here.
It just feels that way because I think time flies, but it's actually been a couple of years.
It sure does.
But it's a pleasure to be here, certainly.
Good to see you.
I want to thank you and the members for having me be heard today. Also thank the Governor Brown as well as Secretary Kate for giving me this opportunity. I'm bringing to you 24 years of state service. Most recently 10 months or so to 12 months as the Undersecretary role. Prior to that, 3 years at the Board of Parole hearings. Prior to that, about 4 years at the Office of Internal Affairs. And prior to that, about 5 years at the Inspector General's office, and then 10 years at the State Controller's office. And so it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon to see that we finally have some good leadership at the Inspector General's office and at the Board of Parole hearings. So I thought, on advice of some of the staff here, that before we got started, I would spend just a very brief amount of time explaining the role. I'm representing the department today, whom we're somewhat infamous for our reorganizations. And in the most recent iteration of our reorganization, we separated some of the functions and downsized our executive leadership in about May of 2011. So currently, as it stands, the role that I sit in is mostly administrative, and it has all of the classic administrative functions that you would expect to be there in terms of human resources, in terms of budgets, in terms of fiscal, procurements, contracting, and the like, as well as IT services, as well as labor relations, as well as facilities management and construction. And that comprises the bulk of time. There's also an Office of Internal Oversight and Research functions that are there. And that really is the bulk. The operations is mostly on the other side of the organization now, where most of the direct service functions take place in terms of managing the prisons, parole, and DJJ, juvenile justice, and the like. The direct service component that I do have, however, is called Offender Services, which is largely the delivery of dental and mental health services. It would be medical, perhaps, in another formation. However, the medical services, we all know, is managed on a day-to-day basis by the federal receiver. So with that brief overview of background and role, prepared to answer any questions or hear any concerns that the members of the committee may have.
I know I have a couple of areas that I'd like to address with you. I'm looking at an email I just received.
Fantastic.
Yes. Yes, breaking news. I asked the question just to remind me about the corrections deficiencies, budget deficiencies that have occurred over the past number of years. And in fiscal year 10-11, it was $1.15 billion, broken down between more on the receiver side, but some on the CDCR side. 9-10. $517 million for the receiver. 8-9. I know that the deficiencies go back even farther. And my question is, when it comes to the site management, the wardens, the administrative staff at the institutions themselves, is there any consequence, accountability for going over budget?
So let me answer that question both generally and specifically, and even get into an awkward specific situation where I can tell you, and maybe I'll start there, that yes, there is consequence. And difficult as those decisions can be, I can tell you that either folks are redirected or removed from their positions when bad things happen out there. And again, I don't want to get into the details of a specific institution, but we did have an instance where I felt my colleague, Undersecretary McDonald, felt very strongly that something needed to happen as a result of a budgetary issue or problem. But in general, and I think this is the true systemic answer, because we were attempting to break the very cycle that you were describing, Mr. Chairman, which is the recurrence of deficiencies on a regular cycle that has been our fate, largely driven by either, depending on your view, mismanagement in the department or the state fiscal crisis or an optimal mix of the above. But we seek to avoid the very thing that you described, that accountability should be an important part of our business, an important part of our values, but it also has to come with a measure of fairness. And by fairness, I mean that it is one thing to hold people responsible for their budgets, and that's entirely appropriate. But those budgets that are provided to those managers have also got to be fair in terms of their allotments. And then if we don't give them a fair, accurate budget that really reflects the true operating costs of their business, it's not very fair to hold them accountable in the form of their careers or their jobs in terms of whatever the consequences there are for, quote, blowing your budget. So what we really seek is
Has the department been fair?
You know, it's a tough way to answer that question. In some respects, I think it's been as fair as it possibly can. But prior to getting the current budget, for which there is a clear policy decision made that goes along with its reduction, and by this I'm referring to realignment, and I do suspect we will talk about that some more here today, there are also instances where unallocated cuts occurred in the department, and then budgets and allotments were given out to individual site-specific managers or programs, and they were simply asked to come up with and make this budget. But it didn't necessarily reflect, and it didn't come with a policy call of this is how you go about effectuating it. I'm oversimplifying it a little, but my understanding is you were just simply given your budget, and your budget had a hole in it. And then you had to come up with ways to solve this, or the department would internally come up with its policy calls related to it. And so this is a long way of answering your question, but you might, to the recipient of that budget, I would say that that's not fair, and I would make an argument that it's not fair. But to the provider of it, you know, the reality is we have X amount of dollars, and you need to back into that amount of dollars that we have, and that's all it is, and we have to enforce that you have to live within your means.
So if the premise is in many instances it's not fair because the demand for security and operating prisons is greater than the resource, what are you telling us here? That you need more, corrections needs more money?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I think it couldn't be any clearer to us in this budget cycle and in the future years that we have to live within our means. And the legislature and the administration gave a fair amount of sum last year to the department, both in terms of solving its deficiency at the end of the fiscal year, as well as some structural deficiency money in the tune of about $379 million, which was, I think, a lot to ask for and a lot for folks to do, given the context of all the difficult choices that were being made, both in the administration and as well as in the legislature. In addition to which, this year we were given realignment. Very substantial policy call, state of the law in California, and it comes with some downsizing related to it. I'm pleased to report today that we think we'll hit all of the targets that are in there and live within our budget today. But in doing this work at the same time, we have been trying to baseline and zero out different parts of our budget and our program. And there's a lot of moving parts to this, Mr. Chairman and Senators. And what we are trying to do is give people what we think are fair allotments. And so we did something different this year, and if I may get your indulgence to describe it. For the first time, we were able to put out very early in the fiscal year, and in fact before the fiscal year started, an allotment to the individual prisons or to the individual programs, and to have a back and forth with them about, does this accurately reflect the cost of doing business? And there's lots of areas of agreement, and there's lots of areas of disagreement. And we've spent the course of this fiscal year going back and forth on a rigorous month-to-month basis to get to that right number, where we think the allocation is appropriate and also that we think it is fair. And we've also tried to get ourselves in position now for a second generation, I would call, budget methodology that is more accurate, more reflective of operational needs and expenses, and more fair. And so that we are heading into the next fiscal year where we're comfortable, we hope, getting to the place where we have made the allotment. It is, in fact, accurate. It does reflect operational need, and it is, in fact, fair. And then give those managers out there a fair chance to manage to their particular allotment and their particular budget. And we're not stopping there. We've launched a number of fiscal academies. We're making a heavy investment, and this is part of the fairness, as well as building the business acumen to manage budgets so that folks will have the team, they'll have the knowledge, they'll have the advocacy, they'll have the understanding.
So given that process you describe, how long do you think it will be until the department can report to the legislature that it has no deficiency to seek post-budget? This year, next year, 2 years?
My understanding is that we have a report that is due this year to the legislature. And so it is something that we are formulating, and we are in the midst right now. And I think I'm pleased to report further along this year than we have been in years past, and knowing exactly where the department's budget is, so that answer doesn't come in June or mid-June, or it doesn't come in May. Our expectation is that we're going to have a really good feel of where we are budgetarily by the end of this month. And we're feeling pretty good from the information that we have and the projections that we have.
Which means no deficiency.
Coming in on budget, correct.
No deficiency. Okay.
If I might make one exception to that, and it comes in the area of special repairs, where at any given time our facilities have been in dilapidated states, and I don't think that comes as a surprise for the folks that have been out there. But at any moment, there could be some particular catastrophe that we're not prepared for.
Emergency or unexpected.
Correct.
But generally, we can expect no deficiency this year other than that exception. That's good. One last area of questioning. Given realignment and the fact that parole is essentially, in many instances, turning into probation, and you are responsible from the department and, as you described, for mental health services, what relationship do you have and does the department now have with the Department of Health Care Services around the implementation of the Mental Health Services Act? Because, as you know, Prop 63, the Mental Health Services Act, does not allow the money to be spent on in-custody or parole. But it does allow the resources, depending upon county priorities, to be spent on probation. So I'm just wondering whether or not your duties now encompass working with that act and its implementers and the counties to ensure that people who leave your institutions, the state's correctional institutions, have access to mental health services.
Okay. I'm going to be a little bit out of my depth on the specificity of your question with respect to Prop 63. I do know that there's a lot of work groups that have been formed around this particular subject and a lot of attention paid to the specific transfer of the more complex cases related to mental health. And it's an issue that did pop during the implementation of realignment. Our folks do spend a lot of time working with the counties now related to this. Whether this specific issue of Health Services Act is being joined, I can't tell you. It's something that I'll have to get back to you.
I would ask you if you would please, not an unfamiliar, it's not an unfamiliar response actually. Because the Act, even though the Act is now 7 years old, it's really, I think, hitting its stride in crucial stages of implementation. I would ask you that you get familiar, please, with the Act and its relevance to the population that you are serving, because I think it can be of great help in fulfilling your mission.
Okay, do that.
Thank you. Senator Alquist.
Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem. I'll just jump right into the questions here.
Certainly.
While you were the executive officer of the Board of Parole Hearings, the board sent in an application to the Office of Administrative Law to codify their psychological evaluation procedures. At first, OAL denied the regulation, which is a somewhat rare occurrence, I understand. Eventually, the board addressed OAL's concerns and the regulation was promulgated. So my first question is, given this new era of realignment and your position as Undersecretary, what lessons did you learn from having a regulation denied by the OAL?
Yeah, I think there's two lessons in there. First, the denial from OAL was on, from my understanding, technical basis. It wasn't the substance of anything that was in the regulation, but it was simply the packaging and the back and forth related to that. And it ended up being somewhat confusing, I think, for the Board of Parole Hearings as well as myself, where initially there was a decision and a recommendation from OAL that the policies that you're using are underground regulations, and therefore they should be regulations. So when the board then prepared a regulatory package and submitted it, the response from OAL was, why do you necessarily need to have these regulations? So there was some, to be candid with you, some confusion, I think, between the two organizations, which, is part of the technical pieces of it. And so one of the lessons from me, I guess, are both in the areas of outreach, which is, one, talk to OAL and be very clear about what the expectation is on the front end so as to avoid situations or problems like that. But then secondly, there's another part of it, which isn't so much between the departments, but on controversial regulations, for which that one was, there are some folks that are impacted for it, and I think I could have done a better job at that time on the outreach side of talking and threading through some of those issues so that, again, it smooths out the overall regulatory process, both procedurally as well as the substance of it.
Thank you. Next area of vision for CDCR. The courts have indicated that receivership of our prisons may be over. Realignment is reducing our prison population to where at some point very soon a gymnasium might actually be used as a gymnasium in this environment. Hopefully the legislature, the administration, and CDCR can do other things besides dealing with the most recent problem that has risen out of our prisons. And my question to you is, Undersecretary, you will have a very influential role in how CDCR will look in the future. You hopefully are in a role where you can be proactive rather than reactive. As a person in this unique position to shape the organization, what does correction and what does a really effective, because not just any model, but an effective correction and rehabilitation model look like to you?
Well, thank you for that question, Senator. And it's very timely in terms of where we are in the history of implementing realignment. And in your setup to the question, you talked about the prospect that gyms would be restored. And so I think it's important for you to be aware of and let the committee be left with an impression that, in fact, it is happening. It isn't just a possibility. It's a reality where dorms and multi-purpose rooms and areas of the facilities that were constructed for a given purpose are actually happening. And by this I mean that you can go occasionally and tour certain prisons and actually see inmates playing basketball in a gym that was designed for basketball to be played in, as opposed to having folks triple bunked in those situations. And in terms of the timeliness of this question, as we embark on wind down on the first year of implementation of realignment and begin to embark on the second year, a very fascinating thing is happening for the department, and a grand opportunity, if you will, has been created. And I'm speaking from the perspective of a departmental official. There are certainly a lot of challenges, a lot of obstacles, a lot of issues to deal with statewide in California. But in terms of the department, we are now able to ask ourselves, if we're not an overcrowded system, which is a system that my colleagues have operated in for years, decades, what does the best, most responsible, most efficient, most effective prison system for California look like? And whatever that level is, because at its height they were at 172,000, and if we're in a world where it's 110,000 inmates in our population, that's a very, very different operating environment. So what does that look like in terms of staffing, in terms of housing units, in terms of prison systems, in terms of missions, in terms of the ability to have out-of-cell time, in terms of programming? It's just an enormous opportunity. So as a department official, I can tell you that my colleagues and I are really excited at the opportunity to determine what that looks like and to come forward with proposals and ideas about how it is you can put the very best prison system together for California given these circumstances.
This may be an unfair question, but in 4 sentences, what does that look like?
Again, because all of our energy and effort has been in really implementing and standing realignment up in the safest, most responsible way and transitioning this population and this responsibility from the state to the communities. That really has been, albeit myopic and tunnel visioned as it's been, but it has been so important in terms of this public safety handoff to focus on that and that only. We haven't had the time to get as visionary, I guess, as we would have liked to, but that opportunity is on us, that time is on us. I can tell you there's a lot of analytical work that is going on.
And sometimes it takes a lot of time to think about that.
And it's a design that isn't for next year or the year after. This is 4, 5.
My last
if this
question,
is what the future of the system holds.
which is a follow-up on the realignment. What steps have you taken to reevaluate the need for additional capacity previously authorized by the legislature?
Yeah, that is perfect segue and is part of the planning that we're doing now. Given the drops in population as dramatic as they have occurred over time and none bigger than realignment, we've essentially hit the pause button on construction. The concern is really overbuilding for a capacity that we may not have. Those decisions and those plans that were made and those plans that were submitted to the court and in fact then ordered by the court happened in a time that was prior to realignment. So it's been appropriate to stop and defer for a moment, do a lot of the analysis that we were talking about earlier this morning and here today to put together what we think is the best and most responsible plan. We've telegraphed and signaled this to the courts in official filings and in telephone calls and otherwise. To their credit, the courts have been receptive and respectful. They understand what it is that we're trying to do in California, and so I don't think we're looking at the other alternative, which is a set of hearings on why did we stop. And so we're pleased right now that we're also getting the opportunity from that branch of government and those courts that have a lot of supervision and say over what we do to get this chance to do some of the planning, and construction being really one of those parts of the puzzle.
Thank you. I do believe that is the priority right now. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem.
Thank you very much, Senator Alquist. Senator Dutton?
Hi there.
Hi.
Well, I think I'll ask you a little bit about one of my favorite subjects, and that's the federal receiver and our health issue. You and I had a good discussion about that yesterday, and I know there isn't a lot of things you can actually do regarding that. However, I would. I've been here now for going on 9 years, and I've been kind of inherited this problem a little bit when it came up, and I keep asking the same question: what's it take to get it so we can have control over our own prison? And one of the things you and I are medical for our inmates. What would be wrong with being able to contract out our health care services to, like, let's say Kaiser? Why not invite them to bid on providing health care? They're the largest employer in the state of California. They're up and down the entire state. Has anybody, to your knowledge, ever entertained that idea, or has it been explored, or is that even possible?
No, and since you raised it yesterday afternoon, it was the first that I had heard of it. And I haven't had an opportunity to ask around town, is this something that is, plausible or reasonable? My own instinctual reaction is I do know that there's a body of law that exists out there that we would have to analyze into thread in terms of like functions, of whether or not those functions are not already provided by a state workforce, and what are the conditions by which you could get an exception. So that would have to be certainly part of the analysis related to that. It's an interesting proposition in the time that we're in, because right now we're meeting and conferring and having a discussion with the receiver's office as well as with the plaintiffs in that case, which is essentially a meet and confer process that was ordered by the judge in the Plata case to bring me a set of standards and criteria for determining how it is that we know that you would be compliant. And whether or not the notion of contracting with Kaiser or a big entity like that would make sense in a prior discussion or part of the discussion of how you would return this to the state in an effective manner, or whether it would become after we conclude those negotiations and have an agreement on how it would come back to the state of California. I don't know where that would fit in that particular mix, but certainly it's a worthy question to ask of, is that helpful on the front side of this discussion, or is it helpful on the back side? And at some point, I am part of the meet and confer process. I have no issue asking the question inside that context of this advance our efforts to accelerate the return of control to the state of California or not, and if not, why not?
Well, one of the things, obviously, and I know this isn't a Democrat or Republican issue. All of us get beat up and down in their districts and they always bring up the cost of the prison system, and of course, the biggest cost driver has been the medical portion of that under the receivership of the federal courts, and so it makes it a little tough. They don't understand. Frankly, a lot of us don't understand. But I'm certainly getting tired of people, being upset with something that I'm upset with. And I just feel so helpless right now. And I'd like to think when I'm out of the Senate at the end of this year that we finally will have control over the prison system fully, and that we can actually somehow show that we solved at least one problem, no matter how long it took. But I would really be, I'm encouraged because I know you're a good administrator. Yeah, I remember interviewing you back in 2008 when you were here in another capacity, and you certainly were impressive back then. You're known for your administrative skills, and we're also looking at a new computer system. How's that going to help you with your responsibility?
Well, we've got a couple of them going. SOMS is probably the one that you're referring to, which
yeah.
is the Strategic Offender Management System. And for all intents and purposes, we do think it will help. I think it will be very significant in the context of realignment and the downsizing and adjustments that have to happen in the department, that it could be the thing that we look to be able to maintain our performance and keep our level of efficiency up while we're in a period of dropping our population. So I think it's going to be a very powerful, very hopeful business tool for us. It's, in some of its earlier deployment stages, they've gone well. The system seems to work. It went statewide with a base software rollout in October, which, knock on wood, went very well and is statewide. There's still some major pieces to go, but just like we have stopped and hit that pause button to reassess facilities, construction, and other parts of the program, because of realignment, it changes some of maybe the business needs or the function that we need. So that project is also going through a process of what we call rebaselining, which is to make the proper investment in the right pieces for the best system that we can put together over the course of not just next year, but what do we look like 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. So again, good progress to date for the system, but it's important for us, again, to stop and take a look and recalibrate that system to match what we think is the new future need for the department.
Good. Thank you.
Senator De Leon.
Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem. Senator Steinberg actually struck a chord with regards to the issue of budgets, and I know that you have a long history over 12 years working in some capacity with regards to the prisons. I think a few years with the Inspector General's office, as well as a few years at the Board of Parolees. Let me ask you this question with regards to, because this is a core that strikes at, with the public as well, too, with regards to the costs of the budgets with regards to how much it costs to house an actual prisoner in California. I took note of the conversation dialogue between you and the president, and my understanding, and I think you have a better read, is it's $50,000 approximately in the aggregate, disaggregated number, what it costs to house a prisoner in California. If that's the cost number, that's an awful lot of money, don't you think?
That is one aggregate number. I've seen the number between 45 and 50,000 when you add in medical, mental health and dental pieces. My understanding is that the general break is that it's about 30,000 per inmate.
30,000.
But that's just one piece. But if you overlay, you're adding about $14,000 to $15,000. For the other portions.
The additional 14 to 15,000 or 20,000?
Yes, 14 to 15,000.
14 to 15,000.
Add in all of the medical, mental health, and dental services.
And that is, so the baseline, if you will, is $30K on an annual basis.
Yeah, and I mentioned that because when you do state-to-state comparisons, usually there's a breakout like that.
And the 14 to 15K with regards to mental health benefits and dental and health care, that's for all inmates?
That's an average.
Or is that assigned per inmate?
That's an average, so that cost is spread out. The higher expenses, of course, being with the older population.
When you disaggregate the data, obviously they're a cost driver, much more so. Isn't that still an awful lot of money, you would say?
Comparatively across systems, perhaps. We think the medical, when we've done comparisons, is higher in California.
So is it a question?
Places.
Is it a question in our?
My understanding is that 30,000, may or may not be higher.
Comparable
in a lot
to
of places.
other states,
right? But it is also, again, you got California, higher cost of living, higher salary and wages.
That's true. No doubt about it.
So I'm not trying to be, too glib, but it is.
I understand, but that is accurate. It costs a lot more to live here in California than it does maybe if you work in the prison system in East Texas or Mississippi or Louisiana. No doubt about it. And I agree with that. Because it goes to the issue of budgets and what the president, brought up. I'm going to correlate this with the recidivism rate. I know I asked, I apologize, Mr. Barton earlier. Robert A. Barton, exactly. Mr. Barton, earlier with regards to recidivism rate and why it's so high, you have close to 14 years of experience. Give us your perspective. And I know it's always been high pre the budget crisis and the economic crisis that we're facing here in California. So this is not just rooted entirely with regards to severe budget cutbacks.
Correct. So if I could, for a moment, because you're doing this in the context of the budget, and when you were having your dialogue with Mr. Barton, I did have a couple of thoughts
Sure.
that I was hoping you would ask, and I would get to share those.
You got a softball. Let's see what you do.
So the first one is, in general, we get the budget piece of it. And this fiscal crisis has given us the ability to use the budget as what it should be, which is a fulcrum or a lever or a lens by which you should set your highest priorities. And so we use it to increase our focus on the value of the return on every dollar, the outcomes that we're producing, how can we innovate, if there's any innovation to be done, on how we can improve our bottom line better. And part of our business is public safety and reducing recidivism. There's an effort to recalibrate some of our program areas and our strategic plan to more fully and effectively measure recidivism. And the recidivism rate for the department, which I know is described as high, It also depends on how you're measuring it. The recent reports or conclusions that we're finding in terms of how we're measuring recidivism actually showed a reduction of either 2 or 2.5%. I might have that number wrong, but the number that I don't have wrong is that that's 2,700 fewer folks that recidivated or re-victimized folks in our community. And because we're California and it's the law of large numbers, that's quite a bit. And I would argue that or suggest that, that's an improvement and that's effective. And because it's an important measure of any correctional system across any state in the nation, it's the right measure. And so we have I think we're on our third generation to come out, but we've certainly issued our second generation recidivism report. It's available on our website, and I can make it available to you in hard copy. It has a lot of the data and the information that you were asking about with Mr. Barton, and I would encourage folks to look at that. I think it goes to some of the concerns and issues that policymakers will be interested in, because each generation we've added something new. And then the latest component that we're going to do in the third generation is add the effects of some of our education programs. And so now for the first time, I think in the department's history, that these guys have just done a tremendous and incredible job now of stitching results back to the offender population in terms of the services that they got, substance abuse treatment, education and the like, their age, and all the usual demographic information. But it connects with the investment that we're making, again, back to the larger answer to the question, the investment that we're making, what value are you getting on that, and are you measuring it against something that is one of the true most important effective measures for any correctional system, which is recidivism.
Now, so what you're saying is, if I'm correct, is that other folks are using a different methodology when you measure recidivism rate in comparison to the methodology that you're applying with regards to the 2 to 3%, albeit tiny, nonetheless, a step forward with regards to the recidivism rate decreasing.
Yes, they can. So because it's troubling, you can get into this apples and oranges and pineapples deal as you look across different state systems. Our team recognized that, I think, and this predates me. This is just the work that they've done, which, I'm going to stand here and take credit for today. Not really. It belongs to them. But they got out in front of this. And so our report actually reports it on whether you recidivated in the first year, the second year, or the third year. And the number that I gave you, the 2% or 2.5%, 2,700 additional offenders, is the 3-year measure, which is the hardest, longest view of measure. And so it comes from a snapshot in time of people from 06, 07, if I've got the math right on that. So because there's variation across different states and people measure things differently, the CDCR report reports it all. So if you want to look at 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, you've got a different way of measuring, all of that information is in there in a very transparent way. So that, California's version of this report or this team's report is to lay out the facts as they are. And in some measures, if you're looking at a different standard, we might be right where the rest of the nation is.
So let me ask you a question. So if you take the universe of those who... the recidivism universe, if you will, within the 1 through year time frame, which is the highest peak you get of individuals who end up coming back? Is it usually within the first 12 months? Is it the second 24 or the 36?
My understanding is, and I really encourage all of or anybody who's interested to read this particular report, but the recidivism rate tends to be higher in the 3-year mark. Just because it's a longer duration of time. But at the same time, we know that if folks are going to recidivate, there's a big bounce in the first 6 months, but then there's some leveling out that goes on. Again, my understanding over the period of 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years. But 3 year is the longest measure, and that's where the rates are generally higher.
And the reason, and I'll ask you the same question to ask Mr. Barton. Through your experience, and I know you're undersecretary on the admin part, but obviously you've been exposed to this. So I feel and trust that you know a lot about this and you have your own opinions too. What are the main factors, variables that contribute to the high recidivism rate that we have in the state of California, both external as well as internal within the system?
The biggest one is probably the parole violator piece, which folks have historically spent a lot of time talking about, and that's what separates us from other states. is that in California, we count as part of our measures and our standards of returns to prisons, we have a high parole violation rate that accounts for that. And I might have this wrong, and if I have to correct myself later, I will, but it may add somewhere between 20 to 30%.
So it's not apples to apples, and if we do a comparison and juxtapose,
right. Other states won't have that involved, and so you'll hear a state is at 45 or at 47%, but they don't have the same system per se that you might have in California, which is why it can be deceiving to, again, you get Massachusetts rates or Rhode Island's rate, and then you apply it to California. You have to make sure that we decouple and disassemble it, so you end up with an apples to apples assessment. And again, our report really details and breaks that out, so that again, if the more you drill down on this, the more you can get this apples-to-apples comparison.
Okay, the last thing, and it's not so much a question, but perhaps just a few thoughts articulated loudly, is you said a couple points that resonated with regards to, the outcomes, if you will, and if we're going to have a culture that is a culture of warehousing or keenly understanding, obviously, and I understand the difficulties of super violent prisoners, folks who come from a culture of violence, family, gang members, and they were born into gangs, and it's a vicious, ugly cycle. And once they get into the prison, it's almost a system that's set up for failure once they get out. Lack of skill set, no high school diploma, obviously very shattered, low self-esteem, the lack of ability to self-regulate, if you will, hence you get in trouble, the sense, the slightest perception of disrespect, what have you, you become reactionary, and then the whole chain just starts happening all over again, and then you end up in prison again. And that taxes the system, obviously, because obviously we make the decisions when it comes to budgets, and those are taxpayer dollars, and what are we going to do to have better outcomes, if you will, and benchmarks. If you come into prison, if you do your time in prison, that you'll walk out of these gates, and hopefully that the recidivism rate or the chances are minimal that you'll be returning back to the system. And I don't know if that's a question of culture. On one end, I heard you say you're doing all you can given the budget cuts and all the challenges, that the system is plagued with at the moment. You don't have the time, the luxury to sort of have a vision statement and a mission statement. We'd love to, under the best circumstances, have these outcomes, what have you, et cetera. But just share with me a little about that right there.
Yeah, well, I don't think the opportunity is completely lost, and if I overstated it or left you with the impression that all we can do is just keep our heads above water, I think that might have been the case, honestly, in the early days of realignment. But we're getting past that, and while all that was going on, not everybody was drawn into the orbit or the gravity of realignment. There's still a fair amount of work that was going on that was getting results, reducing recidivism, being very helpful prior to realignment. Realignment has just been the big seismic giant push that is going to make or create the opportunity for us to come up with a better system, we think, overall, where people spend more time out of their cells, or there's more accessibility for programming and the like. But
okay, and Mr. President, if I can just one quick short question, since you'll be working as Undersecretary directly under Secretary Kate, can you name or articulate 2 positive characteristics that he possesses and 2 negative characteristics that he currently possesses right now? Is he here? Oh, there it is. I apologize. Yeah, okay. Yeah. He doesn't have a vote up here. Please feel free.
I'm sure that was a rhetorical
We have a witness protection program. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take witnesses in support.
May I add one thing?
Yes, of course.
Mr. Pro Tem?
Of course.
As the Pro Tem mentioned earlier, and I say this because there are a lot of people in this room who will have great impact on our prison population and therefore on our communities at large. Pro Tem mentioned Prop 63. I really ask that you make really good use of that. And the other piece that I ask is that there's a great correlation between people who have dyslexia and who are in the prison population. Because many of them never learn to read, and then you get into the recidivism rate. And so my ask of all of you is to really carefully look at a better way to screen people to see what educational deficiencies and learning disabilities they have, because I think that will go a long way to decreasing the recidivism rate. Thank you.
That's right. I think all good points. Witnesses in support. There you go. Welcome again.
Thank you. Thank you. Dawn Kepke with McHugh Kepke & Associates, again, on behalf of Crime Victims United of California. Again, while we're not entirely thrilled and certainly have grave concerns with the proposals and policies that the department is implementing and is charged with, that notwithstanding, we believe that Mr. Hoshino is a man of integrity. His door's always been open to hearing from victims and the victims community. And for that reason, those reasons, we support his confirmation. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there witnesses in opposition? Well, let me just say, with regard to Mr. Hoshino and really the three nominees we've seen here today, pay a compliment to the governor and to Secretary Cate, who's here with us. One of his two good characteristics is I think that there is a real good team in place. And these are crucial times as we implement a major policy change where people, we just heard Ms. Kepke say she's got concerns. Others have concerns. Some of us view this as great opportunity and view the status quo as a bit broken. But nonetheless, regardless of what your opinion is, it's going to take good managers and people who really are committed to the original mission, but also the changed mission of this department. And I think that brought forward three good nominees today, including Martin Hoshino, who, is sort of the utility guy around the department in terms of the various positions that you have served in. And so we're happy to support your confirmation. Moved by Senator Ahlquist. Please call the roll.
Senators Ahlquist. Ahlquist, I. DeLeon. DeLeon, I. Fuller. Dutton. Dutton, I. Steinberg.
Aye.
Steinberg, aye.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. Thank you.
Good. We'll see you back next year in a different. Thank you. Thanks. Very good. Okay, it's all three of you. Let's see if we can finish the agenda here. We've got Senator Dutton, items 2 through 11, and then items 1 to 3 on the walk-in list. Have any questions, concerns? Any other senators, I should ask? Not just Senator Dutton. Take your time. Take your time. Free walk. No executive session today? No. Yes, thank you.
One and two is okay.
Okay, hold on. We'll go. So let's, if we might, let's take a motion then on items 2 through 11 and 1 and 2 on the walk-ons. Is that all right? Did you say? No, number 1 and 2 on the walk-ons. You said you had a problem with 3. So we'll take that one separately. Oh, I'm sorry. So
Try to be consistent. I really do think that.
I got you.
You've got somebody requesting now, we've got They still have 11 bills remaining, allocations remaining. They still want to get a waiver. If we're going to have a limit, let's have a limit. Otherwise, just don't have a limit anymore. This has been a problem since I remember going back to my days in the Assembly when I first got elected. It's always been a problem, and there's nearly no reason why members shouldn't be able to manage their bill allocation. Otherwise, why have the allocation?
Well, Senator Price, there are different circumstances. Sunset bills, for example, are sort of part of the committee responsibility, and sometimes you don't get permission to introduce them as committee bills.
I understand. And Price happens to have 38 bills right now. He still has 2 more, and they're still. See, that's the whole problem. They aren't even trying. Some of the members, and I've carried legislation with Price. I'll probably like his sunset bills. The same thing with Correa, but man, where do you stop it? I mean, and I've already told all the members of my caucus, don't even ask me. Okay, if you can't manage your allocation better, because it costs us money every time somebody introduces a bill anyway. And but that's the reason why. I mean, that's.
I think you make a fair point. I do think that. I do think in these instances, given the deadline and the fact that these members, I do think work their bills. I'm prepared to support this today, but I do think we ought to go back and we ought to, before we put these requests on agendas, I ought to speak to each of the members or somebody from the rules staff to just sort of determine and decipher a little bit more finally what the exact is.
If we're going to go ahead and approve these, I'm going to have it hard to deny it to any other senator that wants to get additional with the waiver. I don't think you can make exceptions. You either have the limit or you don't, and so I think if you just want to take it off.
Well, this is the bill introduction deadline.
This is the end of the line.
Friday. This is the end of the line here. So.
Okay. Well, but everybody can always ask for rule waivers. I've got some bills. Frankly, I've probably got some bills I can give them. But anyway, that was the reason I'm bringing it up. We run into this every year. It's always somebody doesn't do a proper job of managing their ledge package, and then the next thing you know. And I'm sure you've got some spot bills that you've put in there just as a precautionary thing.
Never a spot bill. They're awful.
Yeah, right. for unforeseen that's been a practice. It's been around for a long time. I just think when we get down to this that we ought to either have a bill limit or we don't. So that's the reason why I can't support.
Fair enough. And fair point. I think again, given where we're at, I recommend support, but respect Senator Dutton's position. Okay. So then let's take items 4 through 11 and items 1 and 2 on the walk-ons.
Right.
That's fine. Moved by Senator Dutton. We'll substitute without objection the unanimous roll call, 4-0 on those measures. On items 2, 3, and walk-on 3, moved by Senator Ahlquist. Please call the roll on those measures.
Senators Ahlquist? Aye. Ahlquist, aye. DeLeon?
Aye.
DeLeon, aye. Fuller? Dutton?
No.
Dutton, no. Steinberg?
Aye.
Steinberg, aye.
That's 3-1. Okay. Very good. Thank you for good hearing. Thorough hearing. We'll stand in adjournment.
That whole thing